President Bush, 41, and Mrs. Bush arriving at the cathedral. Jim Baker, long-time Republican, member of the senior Republican establishment in the government of every modern Republican president in some way or another, and his wife. They spend most of their time now living in Houston, though he's been called back into service recently by President Bush. The former Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Nakasone, on the left. And way back in the corner there, Václav Havel, the man who was so instrumental in the Polish Revolution, Solidarity. The current Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, in front of Vice President Gore, a man with a huge burden behind him, Tipper Gore, who, among other things, has taken some of the most beautiful pictures of Washington.
10 of the mourners here, the thousands of Americans who have come to line the streets here outside the National Cathedral, even though maybe 1 in 10 has an umbrella, not one has left. They are standing here with all the tight security, with all the rain, waiting for the hearse to pass on Massachusetts Avenue, take a right onto Wisconsin and into the National Cathedral grounds.
Thanks very much, Jake. Also outside the cathedral, as President Bush and Mrs. Bush goes in, is our White House correspondent, our current White House correspondent, Terry Moran. Terry, talk for just a moment about
coming to you, Terry.
President Bush, 43, and President Reagan.
Well, Peter, we're told that President Bush has been thinking about President Reagan, about his career this week, reminiscing. And one of his aides mentioned that the president, the current president, recalls that in 1968, he was a volunteer in the Senate campaign in Florida, a Republican named Ed Gurney. And he was just out of college and went to a rally at which Ronald Reagan, then California governor and considering a presidential run of his own, spoke. President Bush is remembering this week how electrifying he found President Reagan at that point. He's going to speak very briefly, 10, 15 minutes in his eulogy. We're told he wants to remember Ronald Reagan, the man, and Ronald Reagan, the leader, and he's very conscious that he's speaking on behalf of the nation. And so he will try to sound unifying themes and remember affectionately this predecessor of his.
Coast Guard band.
Yet shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not as a stranger. For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. For if we live unto the Lord, and if we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, even so saith the Spirit, for they rest from their labors.
There's hope, center, base.
John Danforth, the principal celebrant, has also been nominated by President Bush to be the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Over, arch.
For Mrs. Reagan, so many familiar faces.
In his lifetime, Ronald Reagan was such a cheerful and invigorating presence that it was easy to forget what daunting historic tasks he set himself. He sought to mend America's wounded spirit, to restore the strength of the free world, and to free the slaves of communism. These were causes hard to accomplish and heavy with risk, yet they were pursued with almost a lightness of spirit. For Ronald Reagan also embodied another great cause, what Arnold Bennett once called the great cause of cheering us all up. His politics had a freshness and optimism that won converts from every class and every nation, and ultimately from the very heart of the evil empire. Yet his humor often had a purpose beyond humor. In the terrible hours after the attempt on his life, his easy jokes gave reassurance to an anxious world. They were evidence that in the aftermath of terror and in the midst of hysteria, one great heart at least remained sane and jocular. They were truly grace under pressure. And perhaps they signified grace of a deeper kind. Ronnie himself certainly believed that he had been given back his life for a purpose. As he told a priest after his recovery, "Whatever time I've got left now belongs to the big fella upstairs." And surely, it is hard to deny that Ronald Reagan's life was providential when we look at what he achieved in the 8 years that followed. Others prophesied the decline of the West. He inspired America and its allies with renewed faith in their mission of freedom. Others saw only limits to growth. He transformed a stagnant economy into an engine of opportunity. Others hoped at best for an uneasy cohabitation with the Soviet Union. He won the Cold War, not only without firing a shot, but also by inviting enemies out of their fortress and turning them into friends. I cannot imagine how any diplomat or any dramatist could improve on his words to Mikhail Gorbachev at the Geneva summit. Let me tell you why it is we distrust you. Those words are candid and tough, and they cannot have been easy to hear, but they're also a clear invitation to a new beginning and a new relationship that would be rooted in trust. We live today in the world that Ronald Reagan began to reshape with those words. It is a very different world with different challenges and new dangers. All in all, however, it is one of greater freedom and prosperity, one more hopeful than the world he inherited on becoming president. As Prime Minister, I worked closely with Ronald Reagan for 8 of the most important years of all our lives. We talked regularly, both before and after his presidency, and I've had time and cause to reflect on what made him a great president. Ronald Reagan knew his own mind. He had firm principles, and I believe right ones. He expounded them clearly. He acted upon them decisively. When the world threw problems at the White House, he was not baffled or disorientated or overwhelmed. He knew almost instinctively what to do. When his aides were preparing option papers for his decision, they were able to cut out entire rafts of proposals that they knew the old man would never wear. When his allies came under Soviet or domestic pressure, they could look confidently to Washington for firm leadership. And when his enemies tested American resolve, they soon discovered that his resolve was firm and unyielding. Yet his ideas, so clear, were never simplistic. He saw the many sides of truth. Yes, he warned that the Soviet Union had an insatiable drive for military power and territorial expansion. But he also sensed it was being eaten away by systemic failures impossible to reform. Yes, he did not shrink from denouncing Moscow's evil empire, but he realized that a man of goodwill might nonetheless emerge from within its dark corridors. So the president resisted Soviet expansion and pressed down on Soviet weakness at every point until the day came when communism began to collapse beneath the combined weight of those pressures and its own failures. And when a man of goodwill did emerge from the ruins, President Reagan stepped forward to shake his hand and to offer sincere cooperation. Nothing was more typical of Ronald Reagan than that large-hearted magnanimity, and nothing was more American. Therein lies perhaps the final explanation of his achievements. Ronald Reagan carried the American people with him in his great endeavors because there was perfect sympathy between them. He and they loved America and what it stands for: freedom and opportunity for ordinary people. As an actor in Hollywood's golden age, he helped to make the American dream live for millions all over the globe. His own life was a fulfillment of that dream. He never succumbed to the embarrassment some people feel about an honest expression of love of country. He was able to say, "God bless America," with equal fervor in public and in private. And so he was able to call confidently upon his fellow countrymen to make sacrifices for America. and to make sacrifices for those who look to America for hope and rescue. With the lever of American patriotism, he lifted up the world. And so today, the world, in Prague, in Budapest, in Warsaw, in Sofia, in Bucharest, in Kiev, and in Moscow itself, the world mourns the passing of the great liberator and echoes his prayer, God bless America. Ronald Reagan's life was rich, not only in public achievement, but also in private happiness. Indeed, his public achievements were rooted in his private happiness. The great turning point of his life was his meeting and marriage with Nancy. On that we have the plain testimony of a loving and grateful husband. Nancy came along and saved my soul. We share her grief today, but we also share her pride and the grief and pride of Ronnie's children. For the final years of his life, Ronnie's mind was clouded by illness. That cloud has now lifted. He is himself again, more himself than at any time on this earth. For we may be sure that the big fella upstairs never forgets those who remember him. And as the last journey of this faithful pilgrim took him beyond the sunset, and as heaven's morning broke, I like to think, in the words of Bunyan, that all the trumpets sounded on the other side. We here still move in twilight, but we have one beacon to guide us that Ronald Reagan never had. We have his example. Let us give thanks today for a life that achieved so much for all of God's children.
Up. My left. 8. Forward. March.
He certainly got it when it came to the power of image. Will we ever see another send-off like this for a U.S. president?
Boy, I don't know. It's unique, though. I mean, certainly we've had dramatic farewells before. I mean, all the presidents that have been assassinated, whether it's Lincoln or Garfield or McKinley, down to John F. Kennedy, those are always very jarring, harsh moments because we feel terrible that somebody's taken down in the prime of their life. And we also feel like we have lost the commander-in-chief for a moment. We don't know what the next move is. This is so different. I mean, Ronald Reagan has been out of public life for over a decade, and so more or less this past week it's been mournful and respectful, but there's been something celebratory about it. When you mill around Washington, D.C., or if you watch constantly, like I've been asked to do by NBC on the TV set of the California ceremonies, you just see that there's a lot of joy in people's faces. There's a lot of flag waving going on.
The services were so different. As we were watching, for example, in the cathedral yesterday, it was the who's who of political leaders, of world leaders. And then when we looked at the crowd in California, it was Hollywood celebrities. Tom Selleck, Pat Sajak, Mickey Rooney, among many others there. Why was it important for Mrs. Reagan to be surrounded by the Hollywood community?
Those are the people she dearly loves. I mean, she lives in Bel Air, in the heart of that kind of old-time Hollywood community. Those are her real friends, meaning when the media cameras disappear here in a day or two and she's left to her own devices to figure out how to live the rest of her life, those are a lot of the people she's going to be counting on to pull her through her difficult times. I thought that her children, that Michael and Ron and Patty Davis, did an extraordinary job last night of infusing humor in their eulogies, just as their father would have loved. It made really everybody laugh a few times. And remember, that's one of the reasons we all admire Ronald Reagan, no matter what the situation was, no matter how grim. The Gippers seemed to have a one-liner which could crack people up.
Yeah, and let me ask you about perhaps the most gripping and the lasting image of this week-long remembrance, and that was Nancy Reagan last evening, reluctantly leaving her husband's side, the side of the casket. These ceremonies had been so tightly choreographed. That was a truly unguarded moment we were witnessing.
I think it was, and it was the one time that of the whole week where I actually was brought to tears, just because you could put yourself in Nancy's position. She's trying to say her last goodbye. Probably over the last 10 years, she's been waiting for this to happen, but suddenly there it is. You walk away and you're not with your husband anymore. It's sort of the final goodbye at sunset. So she stayed a little longer, said "I love you." You could hear what she was saying. And it was, you kind of got chills and realized that in our own lives we have to go to funerals of our parents and our loved ones. And I think it just captured the human feeling and the drama of mourning and of death.
And a fitting end to a week-long remembrance.
Really was.
Doug Brinkley, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lester.
Now